Rain hammered the porch roof the night my husband handed me a garbage bag instead of an umbrella. 20 years of marriage. And Aaron stood in the doorway of the house I had scrubbed, painted and prayed in, looking at me the way you'd look at a stranger who'd overstayed a visit. His mother's ashes weren't even cold in the ground. I only needed you to take care of my mother, he said, calm as a man reading a grocery list. I waited for him to laugh, to say it was a bad joke. He didn't. He told me to pack. He told me not to expect anything. I want to tell you how I got there, standing on my own front steps, with a suitcase and no coat, because it didn't happen in one night. It happened over 3 years, one small erosion at a time, the way a riverbed disappears without anyone noticing, until the house built on it starts to lean. My name is Rachel Nelson. I'm 45 years old, and until 3 years ago I taught 3rd grade at Maple Hill Elementary. I loved that job, but the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything back. The smell of pencil shavings, the sound of 26 kids reciting the alphabet off key, the way a shy child's face would open up like a window when they finally understood long division. I gave it up the year Evelyn, my mother-in-law, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Aaron said his mother needed someone she trusted, someone patient, someone who wouldn't put her in a home like she was furniture nobody wanted anymore. He said it would be temporary. He said we'd hire help eventually. Eventually never came. So I left my classroom. My kids, my gradebook still half filled with November's spelling scores, and I became a full-time caregiver. I learned how to cut Evelyn's food into small pieces so she wouldn't choke. I learned the exact rhythm of her physical therapy exercises, the exact volume of voice that didn't startle her, the exact songs from the 1960s that could pull her back from wherever her mind had wandered to. There were days she looked at me and called me by her sister's name, a woman who'd been dead for 30 years. There were days she didn't know her own son's face when he walked through the door for 5 minutes before leaving again for work. But she always knew mine. Always. Even in her worst hours when the disease had taken almost everything else, some part of her recognized me as someone safe. Aaron, meanwhile, climbed. He was a sales director for a medical device company, the kind of man who measured his worth in quarterly numbers and steakhouse dinners with executives. He was good at his job, I'll give him that. He was good at looking successful, at shaking the right hands, at wearing the right watch. Our neighbors thought he was a saint for keeping his mother out of a nursing home. They had no idea I was the one who hadn't had a full night's sleep in 3 years. They had no idea I hadn't seen a movie in the theater, hadn't gone out to dinner with a friend, hadn't bought myself a new coat, because every spare dollar and every spare hour belonged to a woman who wasn't even my own mother. I didn't resent Evelyn. I want to be clear about that. I loved her in the strange, quiet way you love someone you've nursed through their worst days. What I resented, what I didn't even let myself name as resentment for a long time, was Aaron's absence. Not just physical absence, though, there was plenty of that. Business trips that stretched longer than they needed to. Dinners he forgot to come home for. Something colder, something I couldn't put words to. A husband who stopped asking how I was doing because he already assumed the answer didn't matter. I used to lie awake next to him on the nights he was actually home, and listen to him breathe, wondering when exactly we'd become two people sharing a mailing address, instead of a marriage. I never asked him directly. I told myself it wasn't the right time, that Evelyn needed stability, that I couldn't afford to blow up our home while she was still alive, and needed both of us, even if both of us had become mostly just me. Looking back now, I think some small quiet part of me already knew how this would end. You don't spend 3 years being someone's unpaid nurse and unpaid wife, without a certain numbness setting in, a bracing for the moment the other shoe drops. I just didn't expect the shoe to drop the same week we buried his mother. I didn't expect him to wait until the flowers on her grave hadn't even wilted before he told me flatly that my usefulness had an expiration date. But that's exactly what happened. And that's why I have to take you back to the porch, the rain, the garbage bag in his hand instead of an umbrella. And the words that ended 20 years in 11 seconds. I stood there in the downpour, soaked through before I even reached the sidewalk, and I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I didn't scream, I didn't beg him to reconsider. I just picked up my suitcase and walked, because some part of me, some part that had been quietly gathering evidence for 3 years, already knew I wasn't losing the home that night. I was finally leaving one I'd never really had. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I reached the end of the driveway. A text from a number I didn't recognize. Rachel, don't leave town. Evelyn left something only for you. 3 weeks before Evelyn died, she had one of those rare mornings where the fog lifted almost completely, and for a few hours she was entirely herself again. I remember it so clearly because those mornings had become so few and far between, that I'd learned to treasure them the way you treasure the last warm days before winter. I was reading to her from an old paperback of Little Women, one of her favorites from childhood, when she reached over and put her hand on mine. Her grip was thin, but steady. Rachel, she said, and there was nothing hazy in the way she said my name, no hesitation, no searching. Promise me something. I set the book down and told her anything. She looked at me with eyes that seemed for that 1 hour entirely clear. Promise me you'll never let Aaron decide your worth. I laughed it off gently the way you do with someone whose mind drifts in and out, and told her not to worry about things like that. She squeezed my hand harder. I mean it, she said. I've watched him. He's my son, and I love him. But I've watched him treat you like tired hope for 3 years, and I won't say it again. So listen now. Don't let him decide by your worth. Then as quickly as the clarity had come, it began to slip. And within the hour she was calling me by her sister's name again, asking if I'd fed the chickens on their old farm in Ohio, a place that hadn't existed in 60 years. I didn't understand not then how much weight was in that sentence. I filed it away as one of Evelyn's lucid moments, touching but confusing, the kind of thing dementia patients say that sounds profound, because we want it to mean something. I had no idea she'd spent the 2 years prior sitting across a desk from a lawyer named Grace Morgan, rewriting the entire architecture of her estate, in absolute secrecy. During those final weeks, Aaron grew more distant than I'd ever known him to be. He was traveling constantly, or claiming to be. His phone, which used to sit face down on the kitchen counter, started staying in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his chest at dinner, at which point he'd excuse himself to the garage to take a work call. I noticed the name, Melissa, appearing on his lock screen more than once. Melissa Carter, a colleague from his office. Someone I'd met exactly twice at company holiday parties, someone who always smiled at me a beat too long, like she was calculating something. I noticed. I want to be honest with you. I noticed and I said nothing. I didn't check his phone. I didn't follow him to the garage and press my ear to the door. I told myself I was too tired to fight, too consumed with turning Evelyn every 2 hours so she wouldn't develop bed sores, too depleted to have the kind of confrontation that would blow apart whatever thin structure was still holding our house together. Some women would call that weakness. I call it survival triage. You can only carry so much weight before you have to set something down, and I chose for those final weeks to set down my suspicion so I could carry Evelyn instead. She passed on a Tuesday morning in early spring with the window cracked open because she'd always loved the smell of rain, and with my hand wrapped around hers exactly the way it had been for 3 years of mornings. She didn't struggle. Her breathing simply slowed, then stopped like a tide going out for the last time. I sat with her for almost 20 minutes before I called anyone, because I wasn't ready to let the world back into the room yet. When Aaron finally arrived 45 minutes after I called him, still smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, he stood at the foot of the bed and looked at his mother's body with an expression I can only describe as inconvenienced. No tears, no collapse, just a long exhale like a man relieved of a scheduling conflict. I told myself grief looks different on everyone. I told myself he was in shock. But something in me, some quiet observer who'd been watching our marriage from a slight distance for years, now filed that moment away too, next to the phone buzzing against his chest, next to the business trips that didn't quite add up, next to Evelyn's hand gripping mine, with a strength that shouldn't have still been in her. The funeral was small, dignified, exactly the kind of understated affair Evelyn would have wanted. Aaron gave a short, polished eulogy that sounded like it had been written by someone who'd read about grief rather than felt it. Neighbors offered casseroles and condolences. I stood at the graveside in a black dress I hadn't worn since my own mother's funeral, and I felt strangely calm, the calm of a woman who has already cried every tear she has in private, alone at 2 in the morning over the course of 3 long years. It was only after the last guest left, after Aaron had gone back inside to pour himself a drink, that my phone rang. I almost didn't answer it. I didn't recognize the number and I was exhausted down to my bones. But something told me to pick up. Mrs. Nelson. The woman on the other end said, her voice measured and professional. My name is Grace Morgan. I was your mother-in-law's attorney. She instructed me very specifically to wait exactly 7 days after her funeral before contacting you. There was a pause, and I could hear papers shifting on the other end of the line. There are things you need to know, Rachel. Things Evelyn made sure of long before she got sick. I'll call you again in 7 days. The line went dead before I could ask a single question. The 7 days after Evelyn's funeral passed like a whole breath. I didn't mention Grace Morgan's call to Aaron. I told myself I was waiting for her to call back before I said anything, but if I'm honest, some instinct in me, the same one that had been quietly cataloging every small betrayal for months, told me to keep it to myself a little longer. On the 7th day, I finally worked up the courage to tell Aaron I wanted to go back to teaching. I'd started thinking about it the moment Evelyn passed, some small flicker of my old self stirring back to life for the first time in 3 years. I brought it up over dinner tentatively, the way you test ice before putting your full weight on it. I told him Maple Hill Elementary had an opening for the fall semester, that my old principal had actually reached out when she heard about Evelyn, that I thought it might be good for both of us to have some normalcy again. Aaron sat down his fork very deliberately. He looked at me the way you look at someone who'd suggested something faintly ridiculous. Teaching. He repeated like the word itself tasted bad. He said I'd been out of the classroom for 3 years, that education had moved on without me, that I'd be lucky if they let me grade papers, let alone run a room full of 8-year-olds. He said it with a small condescending laugh that I'd heard more times over the years than I wanted to admit, a laugh that always made me feel about 2 inches tall. I told him I wanted to try anyway. That's when his face changed, and I watched 20 years of carefully maintained politeness drain out of it all at once. You want to try? He said. Rachel? I only needed you to take care of my mother. He said it flatly, the way you'd state a fact about the weather. I sat there, fork frozen halfway to my mouth, waiting for him to soften it, to explain it away, to tell me he didn't mean it the way it sounded. He didn't. He kept going, his voice rising with something that had clearly been building for a long time. He told me he'd tolerated 3 years of a marriage that had stopped meaning anything to him because his mother needed a full-time caretaker and he couldn't afford a professional one without touching his savings. He told me that was the only reason he hadn't already asked for a divorce. Now she's gone, he said. So are you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare house key, the one I'd given him a copy of years ago in case he ever locked himself out, and set it on the table between us, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then he stood, walked to the front door, and opened it. Outside the sky had gone the color of a bruise, and rain was already starting to needle down against the porch steps. I remember standing up very slowly. I remember my hands not shaking, which surprised me because everything else in me felt like it had been struck by lightning. I went upstairs, packed a single suitcase with the essentials, I didn't even take half of what was mine, and walked back down past him without a word. He didn't help me, he didn't apologize, he just watched arms crossed as I stepped out into the storm with my life reduced to one bag, and no umbrella. Nobody stopped me on the walk to the motel 3 blocks away, the one with the flickering vacancy sign I'd driven past 100 times, without ever really seeing it. Nobody offered a ride. I hadn't told a single friend or family member what had happened yet, because I genuinely didn't know how to say the words out loud. 20 years and I was walking through a rainstorm with a suitcase like a woman half my age fleeing a bad first date. I checked into a room that smelled faintly of beach, and old carpet sat on the edge of a bed that wasn't mine, and finally let myself feel the full weight of what had just happened. I didn't cry now right away. I just sat there soaked to the bone, staring at a television I never turned on, feeling something strange settle over me. Not devastation exactly, but a kind of grim clarity, like fog finally burning off a landscape you'd been driving through blind. My phone rang once that night. Grace Morton's name lit up the screen. I stared at it for a long moment, thumb hovering, and then let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready. Whatever she had to tell me, it could wait one more night. I needed to just breathe first. Back at the house, Aaron poured himself a scotch, and according to what I'd learned much later, called Melissa before he'd even finished his first glass. It's done, he told her, his voice loose and satisfied. I'm finally free. He told her he could see them building something real now, something without the weight of a sick old woman and a wife who'd stopped being useful to him. He told her the house was his, the future was his, and nothing was standing in his way anymore. He had no idea, sitting there with his drink and his certainty exactly how wrong he was. At 8:30 that evening, freshly showered, and feeling lighter than he had in years, Aaron pulled his car into the driveway of the home he believed was entirely his. But as his headlights swept across the front of the house, he saw something that made him ease his foot off the brake. 2 black SUVs were already parked at the curb waiting. For a moment Aaron sat frozen behind the wheel, his mind scrambling through a list of possibilities. A break-in, a neighbor's emergency, some kind of mistake. He told himself it had nothing to do with him, that whatever this was would sort itself out, and he could go inside and finish his drink in peace. He was wrong about that too. He stepped out of the car, slowly, gravel crunching under his shoes, rain still falling in a steady drizzle that had softened from the earlier downpour. A man in a dark suit stepped forward from beside the first SUV, polite but mutable, and asked him to wait a moment. Aaron's confusion tightened into irritation. The particular irritation of a man used to being the one who gave instructions now received them. This is my house, he said. Who exactly are you people? That's when Grace Morton stepped out of the second vehicle, a slim leather folder tucked under one arm, her expression calm in the specific way of someone who has done this exact thing many times before, and feels no need to rush it. She introduced herself. She told him she'd been Evelyn's attorney for the past several years, and that she was here to formally execute the terms of Evelyn's estate. Aaron's irritation flickered just briefly into something like unease, though he covered it quickly with a scoff. He told her he already knew the terms of his mother's estate. He'd seen the will years ago. The house was his, same as it had always been meant to be. Grace opened the folder, and without any particular drama in her voice, explained that the will Aaron was thinking of had been superseded 2 years earlier by a revocable living trust, one that Evelyn had established quietly, with full legal capacity, well before her diagnosis had progressed to the point where her competency could be questioned. Under the terms of that trust, the house had never belonged to Aaron at all. It had remained solely in Evelyn's name, until her death, at which point ownership would transfer in its entirety to whoever had served as her full-time primary caregiver through the end of her life. Aaron laughed a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. He said that was absurd, that no court would uphold something like that, that his mother wouldn't have done this to her own son. Grace, unmoved, turned the page in her folder, and read the relevant clause aloud, her voice even and precise. The language was unambiguous. The caregiver was named specifically, Rachel Ann Nelson. I want to tell you I felt some surge of triumph hearing about this later, some vindicated satisfaction watching my husband's certainty crumble in his own driveway. But when Grace told me the story afterward over coffee in her office, what I actually felt was something quieter and heavier, the realization that Evelyn had spent her last lucid years quietly building me a lifeboat, stitching it together in secret, because she knew long before I let myself admit it exactly what her son was capable of. Aaron's voice rose in the driveway that night, according to the neighbor who later told me she'd watched the whole thing from her window with her hand over her mouth. He told Grace this was insane, that he'd contested, that no piece of paper was going to take his childhood home away from him. Grace, though perfectly composed, informed him that contesting a properly executed trust, prepared by independent legal counsel with documented medical evaluations, confirming Evelyn's competency at the time of signing, would be an extremely uphill battle, and an expensive one. She then handed him a formal notice. He had 48 hours to vacate the premises. I arrived at the house the next morning at Grace's request, still wearing yesterday's clothes because I hadn't packed for more than a single overnight. Aaron was standing in the front hallway when I walked in, surrounded by half-filled boxes. His face a mixture of fury and something raw underneath it, something that almost looked like fear. He turned on me the moment he saw me. "You planned this," he said, his voice cracking with the effort of controlling it. "You and my mother behind my back for years. You knew this whole time." I stood in the doorway of the house I'd scrubbed and painted and grieved in, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel the urge to shrink, to apologize, to smooth things over, the way I'd smoothed over every hard edge of our marriage for 2 decades. I looked at him steadily. Rain still dripping off the hem of my coat onto the hardwood floor. "Evelyn had always asked me to mop on Sundays." "No," I said. "Your mother did." He didn't have anything to say to that. He just stood there among his half-packed boxes in a house that had already stopped being his, staring at a wife he told to leave with nothing, only to discover that she was the one thing his mother had made certain he couldn't take away. Moving back into the house didn't feel the way I expected it to. I thought there'd be some triumphant sense of reclaiming what was mine, but instead for the first few weeks every room felt haunted by a version of my life I was trying to leave behind. The kitchen still smelled faintly like Evelyn's chamomile tea. The hallway still had the small scuff marks from her walker worn into the hardwood over 3 years of slow, careful laps back and forth for exercise. I'd walk past her old room and still expect for one disorienting second to hear her calling my name. I gave myself 2 weeks to sit with all of it before I let myself think about anything else. Then I called Maple Hill Elementary. My old principal, a warm, no-nonsense woman named Diane who'd sent flowers to Evelyn's funeral, didn't hesitate. She said the 3rd grade position was still open, that half the staff had asked about me over the years, that she'd be thrilled to have me back the moment I was ready. I cried on the phone with her, the good kind of crying, the kind that comes from a door opening instead of one closing. 3 weeks later, I stood in front of a classroom full of 8-year-olds again, chalk dust on my sleeve, and felt something in my chest, unquenched for the first time in years. It was through the school that I met Daniel Brooks. His daughter Emma was in my class, a bright, quiet girl who reminded me of the kind of student I used to write future architect jokes about in report card comments. Turns out her father actually was one. Daniel was a widower, his wife having passed from cancer 3 years earlier, and there was something about the way he carried himself that I recognized instantly, a particular kind of tiredness that comes from holding a household together, alone. He showed up to parent-teacher conferences with genuine questions, not performative ones. He remembered the names of the other kids in Emma's reading group. He thanked me sincerely for the small things, for staying late to help Emma with her spelling, for noticing when she seemed off after a hard week. Our friendship started slowly the way real things tend to. He came by one Saturday to fix a section of fence that had come loose in a storm, something he'd offered to do after overhearing me mention it at pickup. He didn't make it a big gesture. He just showed up with a toolbox, fixed the fence and left before I could even properly thank him. A few weeks later he replaced a porch light that had been out since before Evelyn died. When I caught a bad cold in early winter, he left a pot of soup on my doorstep with a note that just said, "Feel better." No reply needed. I remember standing in my kitchen with that note in my hand, feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Not romance, not yet, just the strange quiet relief of being looked after by someone who expected nothing in return. Erin in the meantime had moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place with beige walls and a view of a parking lot. I heard about it secondhand through mutual acquaintances, who couldn't resist passing along the details. He'd tried at first to maintain the same image he'd always cultivated, successful, unbothered, moving on just fine. But Melissa, it turned out, had never been particularly interested in Erin himself. She'd been interested in the version of him that came with a paid-off house and an executive salary. The moment word got out that he'd lost the house, that his mother's estate had bypassed him entirely, Melissa's interest evaporated at startling speed. She stopped returning his texts. She started arriving late to meetings he was in and leaving early. Within 2 months she transferred to a different branch of the company entirely, and Erin was left alone in his beige apartment, with nothing to show for the version of freedom he'd been so eager to celebrate that rainy night with its scotch. I heard through the same grapevine that he'd started drinking more, that he'd grown quieter at work, less the sharp, confident salesman his colleagues used to describe. I felt something when I heard that, but it wasn't satisfaction, not exactly. It was more like the particular sadness you feel watching someone finally wrecking alone and too late with a truth they'd spent years avoiding. Meanwhile my life kept quietly rebuilding itself. I started sleeping through the night again. I started laughing at things without immediately feeling guilty for enjoying myself. Daniel and I began having coffee after school pickups, nothing formal, just two tired adults comparing notes on their strange, upended lives. He never pushed. He never made me feel like I owed him anything for his kindness, which after 20 years of a marriage built on obligation felt like its own kind of miracle. It was late on a Tuesday evening, almost 5 months after that rainy night on the porch, when my phone rang and Erin's name appeared on the screen for the first time since the driveway confrontation. I let it ring twice before I answered, mostly out of surprise. His voice, when I picked up, sounded smaller than I remembered it, stripped of its usual polish. "Rachel," he said, "can we talk?" I agreed to meet him, mostly out of curiosity and partly because some old worn-down part of me still felt like I owed 20 years the courtesy of a final conversation. We met at a small diner halfway between our two lives, the kind of place with cracked vinyl boats and coffee that never stopped refilling. Erin looked different. Thinner, a little grayer at the temples, dressed less carefully than I'd ever seen him. He'd always been a man who ironed his own shirts before important conversations. That night his collar was slightly wrinkled, and something about that small detail told me more than anything he was about to say. He started with an apology, the kind that comes out in a rush after months of rehearsing it alone in an empty apartment. He said he'd been under enormous pressure those last few years, work, his mother's illness, money, worries he'd never told me about. He said grief had made him cruel in ways he didn't recognize until it was too late to take back. He reached across the table at one point like he might take my hand, then seemed to think better of it and pulled back. I let him finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't soften my expression to make it easier for him, didn't offer him the reassurance I might have given freely 20 years ago. When he was done, I asked him one question, the only one that actually mattered to me anymore. "When exactly did you stop loving me?" Loving. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He stared down at his coffee like the answer might be written in the steam rising off it. He tried a few times to start a sentence and abandoned each one halfway through. Watching him struggle, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself accept before. It wasn't that he'd stopped loving me at some identifiable point, some moment I could pin down and grieve properly. It was that he'd never really known how not in the way that mattered. Not in the daily, unglamorous, unrewarded way love actually requires. He'd loved the idea of a devoted wife the way he loved his job title, as something that reflected well on him, not as something that required him to show up for another person when it wasn't convenient. I didn't say any of that out loud. I didn't need to anymore. I just felt the last thread of obligation I'd been carrying without even realizing it quietly go slack. Daniel arrived a few minutes later, right on schedule, because we'd planned to meet for a movie that same evening, and he'd offered to swing by the diner first so I wouldn't have to sit alone in the parking lot afterward. He didn't come inside or make a scene. He simply waited by his car in the lot, visible through the diner's front window, patient in a particular way that had become so familiar to me over the past several months. Aaron saw him. I watched something shift across his face, not jealousy exactly, something closer to a slow sinking recognition. For the first time in his life, Aaron understood what it felt like to be the one standing outside waiting for someone who had already moved on without him. He asked me quietly now, almost pleading if there was any chance we could try again. Start over. He said he'd changed, that losing everything had taught him things he should have learned decades ago. I believed in that moment that he might even mean it. But meaning something, and having earned the right to ask for it, are two very different things, and I'd spent enough of my life confusing the two. I already spent 20 years proving my love. I told him gathering my coat from the back of the bus. I'm not spending another 20 proving my value. I said it without anger, without theater, the way you state something you've simply come to know as fact. He didn't argue. I think some part of him had expected exactly that answer, even if he told her a different one. I left him there in the boat, staring at his cooling coffee, and walked out to where Daniel was waiting. He didn't ask what had happened. He just opened the car door for me the way he always did and let the silence between us be comfortable instead of demanding an explanation. 3 days later my phone rang again, but this time it was Grace Morgan, not Aaron. Her voice had a gentler quality than I'd heard from her before, less businesslike. She told me there was one more piece of Evelyn's affairs that needed to be settled. A sealed letter Evelyn had left specifically for me with instructions that it only be delivered once the estate matters were fully resolved. And enough time had passed for me to read it without the weight of legal chaos clouding my mind. She wanted you to read it when you were ready, Grace said. I think that time might be now. I read Evelyn's letter alone, sitting at the kitchen table where I'd fed her 1,000 small spoonfuls of soup, over 3 long years in the late afternoon light of a Sunday. It felt in hindsight like it had been chosen for me on purpose. Grace had dropped off the envelope that morning, sealed with Evelyn's careful old-fashioned handwriting across the front. Just my name, nothing else. I sat with it unopened for almost an hour before I finally worked up the courage to break the seal. Her handwriting inside was shakier than the handwriting on the envelope, evidence of a hand that had been fading the disease even as she wrote it. She told me she'd known long before her diagnosis worsened exactly what kind of man her son had become. She said watching him treat me the way he did over those years had broken something in her that she never fully told anyone about. Not even her lawyer. Not even in the quiet privacy of her own journal. She wrote that she'd started planning to trust almost 2 years before she died in one of her last stretches of full clarity. Specifically because she knew Aaron would eventually show me exactly who he was, once he no longer needed me for anything. She said she couldn't stop that from happening, but she could make sure that when it did I wouldn't be left with nothing. Near the bottom of the page her handwriting grew smaller, more deliberate, like she'd wanted to get the words exactly right. You stopped being my daughter-in-law the day you became my daughter. I read that line 4 times before it fully landed, and when it did I put the letter down and cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to in years. Not the tight, controlled tears I'd rationed out during Evelyn's illness. Not the numb, disbelieving stillness of the night Aaron threw me out. This was different. This was the particular release of finally being seen completely, and without qualification, by someone who had watched everything, and understood exactly what it had cost me. The months that followed settled into something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for most of my adult life, an ordinary, unremarkable peace. I kept teaching. My classroom filled up again with the small chaos I'd missed, so much spelling tests scraped to knees, the particular pride of watching a struggling reader sound out their first full sentence. Daniel and I kept building what we'd started slowly and honestly, without urgency, without either of us needing the other to fill some desperate gap. Emma started calling me by my first name instead of Miss Rachel, which felt in its own small way like being welcomed somewhere. He proposed on a Tuesday evening in my backyard of all the unglamorous perfect places while we were cleaning up after a simple dinner with Emma. There was no elaborate speech, no restaurant reservation, no crowd of onlookers filming for social media. He got down on one knee beside the garden. Evelyn used to love watching me tend from her window, and he opened a small box holding a modest ring that had belonged to his late wife, Emma's own suggestion, he told me later. Because she said her mother would have wanted someone kind to have it, and she thought I was the kindest person she knew. I said yes before he even finished the question. I ran into Aaron only once after that by accident several months later. I was in the garden with Daniel on a Saturday afternoon, both of us laughing about something small and forgettable, when I noticed a car slow down on the street in front of the house. It was Aaron's, older now, a little worse for wear, much like the man behind the wheel. He didn't get out. He didn't wave. He just sat there for a long moment watching me laugh in a garden that used to be his, standing beside a man who looked at me the way he never had. Then quietly, he drove away. I don't know exactly what went through his mind in that moment, and I've stopped trying to guess. I only know that whatever he lost that day wasn't the house, and it wasn't even the marriage. It was the last chance to understand what it means to be loved by someone who stays fully and without condition long after it stops being convenient. I think about Evelyn often, especially in the quiet moments tending the garden she loved, hearing an old song from her generation on the radio, watching Emma read a book with the same careful concentration Evelyn used to have. I think about her hand gripping mine, telling me not to let anyone else decide my worth, and I understand now that she wasn't just comforting a tired caregiver in a lucid moment. She was handing me the truth she'd learned too late in her own life, trying to make sure I didn't learn it the same way. For 20 years I thought love meant sacrifice giving until there was nothing left, and calling that devotion. It doesn't. Love is being valued while you're still there, not mourned or apologized to after you're already gone. I'd love to know what you think this story means to you, and where in the world you're watching from tonight. Leave a comment below, and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one waiting to be told, so subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going together.